What's going on, everybody? Gareth here, FCP Hero. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today we're going to be working on this F30 328i X-Drive behind us. As you can see, we have a whole bunch of control arms and hardware sitting here on the workbench. In total, 8 control arms and all the associated nuts and bolts that need to be replaced during this job. These are all of the control arms in the rear suspension, minus the lower camber link, which is also the spring arm. We don't have to replace that. That's typically not a common replacement item. So we're not going to be replacing that today. These control arms here are the more likely replacements. And as you can see, they're simply a stamped steel piece that has been basically molded in a die and stamped in a die. Pretty frail components, to be honest with you. It's a little bit of a surprise, seeing as a lot of older BMWs used to have solid aluminum components, and we're starting to transition over to the stamped steel components. Obviously, these are significantly cheaper to manufacture, but one of the downsides on these, let's say you're unfortunate to have a curb strike, or you've hit a pothole, you can bend these control arms, and 100% if that happens, you're going to have to get them replaced, generally because your alignment's going to be way off. So that's it is also a safety hazard. But along with that, they all have these rubber bushings pre-installed in them. These are obviously a wear item over time, so if there's any slop or play in the rear suspension, it can't be aligned properly, the alignment moves around a lot, chances are it's because these bushings are worn out, and that slop in the links between the wheel and the actual chassis of the car is due to these bushings being worn out. So realistically speaking, if you're replacing one, you might as well just replace all of them at the same time and be done with it. And of course, after doing this job, you're gonna have to get an alignment regardless, since some of these components are going to change the alignment once installed and once new. So 100% after you get this done, get an alignment. But now that we talked about what we're gonna be doing today and some of the parts we're installing, let's go ahead and talk about some of the tools you're gonna need to do this job. Some of the tools you're gonna need for the job are gonna be a 17mm socket for removing your lug bolts, an E14 torque socket for the eccentric bolt for the rear toe arm, and then you're gonna probably need every 18mm wrench and socket that you've ever thought you can imagine. So in our case, we have an 18mm half-inch swivel, an 18mm 3/8 drive impact, we have an 18mm deep half-inch, 18mm deep 3/8 inch, 18mm mid-length 3/8 inch, and 18mm shallow 3/8 inch. We also have a couple of different 18mm wrenches, along with this offset wrench that has been cut in half. That is going to be for one of the control arms in the rear. You'll see it in the video. But before you get into doing this job, make sure you get an offset wrench and cut it in half. You're going to thank yourself later. Your future self will thank you. A couple different extensions, including a 1/2 inch to 3/8 swivel. This is more for disassembly purposes, just makes it a little bit easier to deal with. Another extension, 3/8 extension in our case, about a 6-inch length. And we have a variety of different ratchets, 1/2 inch drive to 3/8 drive, flex head, non-flex head, or in this case, are locking flex heads. Makes it a little bit easier to deal with. And then you want a torque wrench that's capable of doing at least 100 newton-meters of torque. And if you have a torque wrench that can do torque angle, that's great as well. But you can always just mark the bolt with a Sharpie and then do the 90 degrees of rotation. But pretty much every bolt you're gonna deal with in this job is 18mm. And every nut you're gonna deal with is an 18mm, with the exception of that one E14 counterhold for the eccentric bolt. So very simple, just need a whole variety of 18mm stuff and you'll be able to do this no problem. So now we talked about that, let's go ahead and get right into the video. So first thing, you're gonna want to get the vehicle up in the air, properly supported and safe. If you're doing this on jack stands, just make sure the car is completely stable and do not get underneath the car just using a hydraulic jack. That will not work, and that is really risking your life. So always use safe jack stands, always be careful, make sure the car is stable, can't say that enough. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna replace the toe link, which is right here. You can see over here is our eccentric bolt, well, washer and nut. There's an eccentric bolt on the other side. We're actually just gonna mark off on the bolt and on the subframe where this was. Now, after doing any kind of suspension work, you are going to have the vehicle aligned regardless. So there's going to be adjustments made after the fact, but this is just to get it close when you put it back together. So always mark off your eccentric so that when you put it back in, you can get it back close to where it was originally. You're going to need an 18mm socket for the nut on the eccentric bolt, and an E14 torque socket to counterhold the eccentric bolt. This goes through, and so it needs to be E14. We'll pull the bolt out so you can actually see what it looks like, but it's a little bit of a goofy design. our outside bolt here, 18 millimeter. And now this bolt's a special one because you see it has this triangular washer on it. This washer would prevent the control arm from slipping off the bushing and potentially coming off the car. So it acts as a safety washer because this whole setup here is in a single shear configuration. Normally in a perfect world it would be a dual shear where this bushing is encapsulated, but on this rear suspension it's a single shear, and that washer is there to prevent the control arm from sliding off the bushing. Not likely to happen, but just in case it ever did, that is to prevent that from happening. So just remove it. And this bolt is replaced. It's a one-time use only. It's torque to yield. So just chuck this in the garbage. Go ahead and pull our eccentric bolt out. I told you it was a special, goofy looking bolt. That's the E14 counterhold. So it just has this really long stud, so you can actually gain access to it through the subframe. We'll go ahead and pull the control arm out. Simple. So we're gonna go ahead and take our new toe link, put it in position. There you can see the eccentric slot. That's how the toe is adjusted. And we just need to get it in there. Sometimes these can be stubborn to get into position. There we go. We're gonna reinstall the eccentric bolt. When you're putting the eccentric bolt back in, the eccentric washer also needs to go in. You can see how this bolt has two slots. Those two slots line up with these two dimples here, like so. So that means the washer can only go one way. And this washer obviously sits here on these channels, and as it rotates, that's what sets or moves the bolt back and forth in that eccentric slot. So just keep that as a reference that when you're inserting the washer, this narrow portion is going to be on top. We are going to use a new lock nut on this bolt. It's really more important that you use a new lock nut than necessarily replacing the washer and the bolt itself. As long as nothing is seized up, you can realistically reuse that bolt as much as you want. So next up, we're going to use a new bolt here at the outer connection. Like I said, these need to be replaced as one-time use. So make sure it gets threaded by hand. We'll go ahead and thread this bolt in. So next thing I want to do is make sure that our eccentric adjustment is lined back up to where it was before. So I'm just making sure that those marks line up. I'm going to use the ratchet here as a counter hold. Then I'm going to go ahead and tighten down the nut. Torque spec on these outer bolts is 100 Newton meters plus 90 degrees of torque. And now we're going to do 90 degrees of rotation. Don't need a fancy torque wrench for this. You can just do it with a marker, but I have the wrench, so I'm going to use it. So the torque on this inboard nut is 100 Newton meters. And so at this point, just going to double check the eccentric washer to make sure it's in the same relative position. It is, so that's been torqued. The outboard bolt's been torqued. And of course, whenever you're torquing suspension components with rubber bushings, you want to make sure that it's torqued at ride height, which we're using the pole jack here to do. The whole point of that is so you don't bind the bushings and prevent premature failure or wear on those bushings, because if you torque it at suspension droop, when the vehicle is now at ride height, the bushing is actually be twisted versus being in its neutral position. So you want to make sure that whenever you're dealing with rubber bushings, that you do it at ride height. All right, so next up, we're going to go ahead and remove the trailing arm. As you can see, it's connected to the subframe and the knuckle. The trailing arm basically just maintains tension on the entire suspension, so as you're moving forward, this doesn't have a tendency to move back and forth. So this is a pretty critical component, but still same stamped steel design. And I would imagine that this component, especially if you have a curb strike or something like that, this is going to be the weak link in the suspension, especially being that the fuel tank is right here. They wouldn't want this to break and puncture the fuel tank, so this would be an intentionally designed weak point. But what's nice is it's only 18 millimeter, so 18 millimeter bolt and an 18 millimeter nut. Go ahead and break these free with a wrench first. So same thing, we're gonna go ahead and bring the suspension up to ride height. or as close to ride height as we can go. And when you're doing this, make sure that you're looking at the corner of the car. So if this thing is on jack stands, you'd be looking to see that it's somewhat lifting off the pad, but you don't want it to be lifted off the pad entirely for safety reasons. So I'm just making sure that the suspension is going up close to where we want to be. And then we'll go ahead and torque from there. There we go. So now we have the vehicle up at ride height. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten down these bolts a little bit more. Tightening torque is gonna be 100 Newton meters on both the inboard and outboard bolt. So I'm gonna work on loosening up the inboard bolt here for this upper control arm. Everything, again, still 18 millimeters. So from a sizing standpoint, nothing really changes on this. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna break it free, get the bolt moving. And then once the bolt's moving, I'm probably gonna use an impact just to speed up the process of getting it out of there. But this is a little bit tricky just because there's not a whole bunch of room to work with. But it's loosening up. That's good. And then we also now need to loosen up the bolt that holds the control arm to the knuckle. This is one of those special bolts that has a triangular safety washer on it. So there's no nut, it's just simply a through bolt. And again, I'm just gonna break that free as well. And now I'm just gonna cheat by using an impact gun to drive out both those bolts. Sorry. Getting this control arm out could be a little bit tricky, but what you can do is you just push it back and then you can get out that way. So now we're going to install our new upper control arm here. You're going to install it with the flat piece facing up and the hollow section facing down. We're going to go ahead and push it in as far as it'll go and then drop it down. I'm going to use a brand new nut and bolt on this. And it's a little bit of a juggling act, but I want to get the bolt lined up on the inside before I put a bolt on the outside. Now the only trick to this, and this is kind of where BMW I think kind of shafted everybody, is instead of having a welded nut on this tab, you have to basically sneak in and put the nut on by hand. So I'm going to hold it in place with my finger and try to get the thread to engage. Just want to get a couple threads going and then I can use tools, but this is the only thing that's kind of annoying about this with the space that they provided. I guess you could probably use pliers if you wanted, but a welded nut on that subframe would have been really nice. There we go. And now we're going to install this new lower bolt. This is the one that has the triangular washer on it. And now we got the bolt started. I'm gonna go ahead and use that impact again to drive it in a little bit. And now I'm gonna go ahead and tighten the bolt and the nut here inboard. I'm only gonna tighten a little bit. I still have to raise the suspension up to ride height to torque it, which is definitely gonna be a little bit of a challenge, but I do have a way of going about doing that. So I'm just gonna go ahead and just bottom it out here. There we go. Now I'm gonna go ahead and bring the suspension up to ride height so I can torque both those bolts. Torque spec is 100 Newton meters. Again, so even though I'm using this very long extension, it really doesn't have an effect on torque being applied. Torque spec is gonna be 100 Newton meters plus 90. Now we have to torque angle this bolt 90 degrees. And obviously it's in a very unfavorable position for that, so I'm gonna try to do it with this ratchet. I marked the bolt, and we're just gonna have to do what we have to do to get this done. There we go, 90 degrees. So this part of the job, this is when you realize, if you haven't watched this video, that you need to go buy an offset 18mm wrench and cut it in half. The position of the nut on this inboard bolt, well, there's really no way to get at it unless you use an offset wrench. And also, it's not really that much room to work with vertically, so go ahead and make yourself a custom wrench. Sometimes you gotta do it. So go ahead, put a wrench up there. Now from this point, we're gonna go ahead, take our 18mm wrench, our brake torque here on the fastener. We're gonna come on here with an 18mm socket, brake torque free. Remember, this bolt is torque to yield, so it's pretty tight. And then once it's free, I'm just gonna run it out here with this impact. Unfortunately, this impact is kind of low on battery right now, so it doesn't have the same juice. I just tightened it. There we go, bolt's out. Now we're just removing this inboard bolt. And the only thing we need to do on this is also remove our ABS wheel speed sensor. Just easier to do after you've removed the bolt. You'll have free access underneath. So we're gonna go ahead and open up this bracket real quick, and then we also do need to go ahead and install it on the new control arm. I'm gonna go ahead and take this flathead screwdriver to hold the lock tab down on this bracket, get it to release. So we're gonna go ahead and install this upper control arm. They are side dependent. There is a left, there is a right. When you're looking at it face on like this, the tapered portion of the bushing needs to be facing towards the rear of the vehicle. So at this point, we're just gonna go ahead and slide it into place. We need to hook our brake pad wear sensor and pad wear sensor wire hanger back into place. Try to do it a little bit loosely, just because we need to get the control arm, the bolts and everything sort of lined up first. Don't want to put too much tension on that right off the bat. So now we're going to come from behind, slide our new bolt in, which with this tiny little sway bar in the way could be a little bit of a cumbersome act, but if you pretend you're holding a cigarette, you should be able to get the bolt started in the hole. Once the bolt's in, I'm gonna go ahead and get the nut started. Again, you kind of have to play with the space that you've been given. Just want to get it started. Last thing you'd want to do is cross thread that. You'd be really angry at yourself if you did. And then once we have that inboard bolt secure, we're gonna take our outboard bolt and get the thread started on that. And now what we want to do is get our ABS wheel speed sensor and brake pad sensor bracket back onto the control arm. So it pretty much just sits in place. Just push those locking tabs together, you hear it click. Then we want to put our pad wear sensor back into place. This only applies to the rear right of the vehicle. Want to go ahead and make sure that the wiring lead is secured. And there we go on that. And now we just need to go ahead and torque these bolts. So 100 newton meters inboard at ride height and 100 newton meters plus 90 for this outboard bolt. So we're gonna go ahead and push everything back up to ride height and torque everything, and that'll be that. Remember, 100 newton meters of torque. Next up, we gotta torque this outboard bolt. That's 100 newton meters plus 90. Then manually turn this one 90 degrees as well, just because of space constraints. That's 90 degrees. It was a little tough to get to on that one, but the upper control arms, there's a whole lot less space. So you have to kind of work with what you have, and you have to get creative on some of the solutions. All right, so that's how you go about replacing all of the control arms with the exception of the lower spring arm on the rear of your F30 3 Series. This will apply to the F22, F23 2 Series, and the F32, F33, and F36 4 Series. It's all the same rear suspension, whether X-Drive or normal rear-wheel drive. It's all the same components. As you can see, It is relatively straightforward. However, it is a little bit tricky, especially when you go to tighten some of the bolts back down at ride height. You just lose some of your space to work with. But as long as you have the tools that we use in this video, you should be able to do it whether you're on a lift or in the driveway on jack stands. But overall, you know, doing this is going to save you a whole bunch of money. It's not that complicated. No crazy special tools required. And as you can see, it is relatively straightforward. So we hope you learned some of this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. Hit that like button if you like this video. Also hit subscribe. We have a lot more videos on the way. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thank you for watching.